I have full confidence in Catherine and William. Their judgment is sound, their loyalty unquestioned.
On December the 12th, 2025, King Charles sat in front of a camera and delivered the words a nation had been waiting 2 years to hear. His cancer treatment, he said, could be reduced in the new year. Not ended. Reduced. He called it a personal blessing and a testimony to the advances made in cancer care. That much is confirmed, on the record, in his own words, filmed at Clarence House for Channel 4's Stand Up to Cancer broadcast. Good evening. I'm going to tell you what actually happened that week, and I'm going to tell you what didn't. Because somewhere between the palace's real statement and the internet's version of it, this story picked up a second narrative that the facts don't support. I went and checked. I want to walk you through both versions, side by side, so you can see exactly where they split. Here's the version that spread. A king, quietly stepping back. A son, quietly stepping in.
Today I am here on this great occasion in the life of our nations.
Somewhere in the same week, a secret transfer of constitutional power, the kind that's never happened before, moving from father to son while the cameras were pointed somewhere else. A quiet coup, dressed up as good news. Here's the version that's actually documented. A cancer patient, 2 years into treatment, sharing a genuine medical milestone through a cancer charity he's long supported. A Prince of Wales, taking on a role that Princes of Wales have held before him, announced by the palace in a press release 5 months earlier, with a named royal official's quote attached to it. 2 stories. Only one of them happened in the shadows. And it isn't the one you'd expect. Before I take you into it, I want to be straight with you about something, because it matters more in this story than most. Some of what's ahead is documented. Palace statements, court records, on-the-record interviews, dated announcements you can look up yourself. And some of it is what gossip aggregators call insider reporting, unnamed sources, quoted in outlets that don't put a name behind the claim, repeated across dozens of near-identical articles until repetition starts to look like confirmation. I'm going to tell you which is which every single time, because that distinction is the entire story here. I read every version of this story I could find before writing this. The dramatic YouTube-style narration, the tabloid write-up syndicated across a dozen near-identical sites, the palace's own statements, the parliamentary briefing papers, the on-record podcast transcripts. What struck me, going through all of it side by side, wasn't that the dramatic version was entirely invented. It's that it was built the way a lot of viral royal content gets built now.
He succeeds me as Duke of Cornwall and takes on the responsibilities for the Duchy of Cornwall, which I have undertaken for more than 5 decades.
Real, small, verifiable facts, spaced out just far enough apart that a narrator can fill the gaps between them with something that sounds like insight but is actually just pace. Sit with that for a second in a script like that is doing real work. It's giving you a moment to feel the weight of a claim before you have time to ask whether the claim is actually true. So let's do the opposite here. Let's slow down at exactly the points where the original version sped up and look closely at what's underneath each beat. I'll separate 3 categories throughout: things confirmed by palace statements, dated legal records, or on-the-record named sources, things reported by credentialed royal biographers speaking on their own authority, like Robert Jobson, which carry real weight but are still one person's account. And things that trace back only to unnamed insiders relayed through tabloid aggregation, which I'll flag every time they show up, because that category is doing almost all of the heavy lifting in the version of this story that went viral. Let's start with what we actually know. 2 years before that December broadcast, in February of 2024, Charles went into hospital for something ordinary. A corrective procedure for a benign enlarged prostate. The kind of appointment that ends in relief, not headlines. During that treatment, doctors found something they weren't looking for. Buckingham Palace, in a short and carefully worded statement, called it a separate issue of concern and confirmed the king had been diagnosed with a form of cancer. They did not name the type. A royal source later told CNN it wasn't prostate cancer. Beyond that, the palace has never specified, and as recently as this past December, a spokesperson explained why. Cancer specialists advised that Charles not identify his particular condition so that his public role could speak to everyone affected by the disease rather than narrowing the conversation to his own diagnosis. That's a stated, on-record rationale for the silence, not a mystery invented for dramatic effect. Charles postponed his public duties, then returned to a reduced schedule by April.
Today, I am proud to create him Prince of Wales, Tywysog Cymru.
That's the stretch of 2024 where he was photographed at the University College Hospital Macmillan Cancer Centre, newly announced as patron of Cancer Research UK, meeting patients undergoing exactly the kind of treatment he was receiving himself. When a reporter asked how he was holding up, Charles' now famous reply, that he was still alive, made headlines precisely because it was so unguarded for a man who rarely says anything unscripted in public. In March of 2025, Charles was briefly hospitalized after experiencing what palace officials described as temporary side effects from treatment. He was back to duties within days. That, too, is confirmed and dated, not rumor. Then came the December 2025 broadcast. What Charles actually said, in full context, was that early diagnosis, effective intervention, and following his medical team's instructions meant his treatment schedule could be reduced going into the new year. A palace spokesperson briefed reporters ahead of the broadcast that Charles had responded exceptionally well, and that his ongoing care would now move into what they called a precautionary phase, to be continuously monitored. Nowhere in that statement, or in any confirmed reporting around it, does the palace describe remission. Nowhere does it describe an ending. It describes a reduction, framed carefully, the way medical updates about an ongoing condition usually are. I want to pause on that word reduced for a second, because so much of what got built on top of this story treats it as though it meant something closer to resolved. It didn't.
The country whose title I've been so greatly privileged to bear during so much of my life and duty.
Royal biographer Robert Jobson, who has met Charles many times and has direct access most commentators don't, said on Tom Sykes' Royalist podcast the following April that he thought the December messaging had been somewhat overhyped, that the palace and the press around it leaned into good news language a little harder than the underlying medical reality justified. Jobson's actual assessment, in his own words, was blunter than the broadcast. "The king is living with cancer," he said, "and he will live with cancer." There isn't a version of this, in Jobson's telling, where it simply goes away. That's not speculation about secret power transfers. That's a biographer with real access describing an ongoing illness honestly. So the honest starting point for this whole story is this. Charles has been managing a long-term cancer diagnosis for over 2 years, has kept the specific type private on medical advice, experienced a genuine treatment milestone in December 2025, and by his own doctor's assessment continues to live with an illness that isn't cured, only better managed. That's the medical reality. Now let's talk about the constitutional claim that got built on top of it. Here's something the original telling of this story left out almost entirely, and I think it's one of the most important pieces of context available, because it shows you, directly, how this specific family behaves when they're managing a real cancer diagnosis without a hidden agenda attached to it. Catherine, Princess of Wales, was diagnosed with cancer in the same window as her father-in-law. She underwent planned abdominal surgery in January 2024, then revealed the following March, in a personal video message, that tests after the operation had found cancer, and that she'd begun preventative chemotherapy. Like Charles, she never named the specific type. Unlike the version of this story built on secrecy and maneuvering, what followed was a fairly open, incremental public record. She was photographed at Trooping the Colour in June 2024 mid-treatment, made a carefully managed appearance at the Wimbledon men's final in July, and announced that September that chemotherapy was finished, telling the public plainly that staying cancer-free was now her focus and that full recovery would take time. By January 2025, she announced she was in remission, describing it as a relief while noting she was still adjusting to what she called a new normal. She and William were later named joint patrons of the Royal Marston, the hospital where she was treated, and as recently as this past June, she completed a personal Three Peaks charity climb to raise money for the same cancer hospital. I'm including all of that because it's the clearest available answer to the question the original story never really asked.
With Catherine beside him, our new Prince and Princess of Wales will, I know, continue to inspire and lead our national conversations, helping to bring the marginal to the centre ground.
What does it actually look like when this family manages a cancer diagnosis honestly, without a competing narrative about power being built on top of it? It looks like exactly what Kate's timeline shows. Diagnosis disclosed in general terms, specific type kept private, incremental and mostly candid updates as treatment progressed, an honest acknowledgement that recovery is slow and hard, and eventually a return to public life built around advocacy for the illness itself. Charles S. Patten, the private type, the honest but general updates, the framing of December's news as a reduction rather than a cure, tracks almost exactly the same shape. That consistency is itself evidence. It suggests a family working from a shared, deliberate approach to talking about illness in public, not a monarch being managed or maneuvered by people around him. This is the part of the story that's spread the widest, and it's the part where the gap between what happened and what got reported is largest. So let's slow all the way down. A royal warrant is an official endorsement. It allows a business, a tradesperson, a supplier, to say their goods are good enough for the crown. It's one of the oldest continuous threads connecting the monarchy to the ordinary economy of Britain, dating back, in its modern form, to the 15th century, when it replaced the royal charter as the way the Lord Chamberlain formally appointed suppliers to the royal household. William Caxton, the printer, was one of the earliest recipients, appointed the King's printer in 1476. Here is the claim that circulated: that Prince William and Princess Catherine quietly became grantors of royal warrants in early 2026, in a formal, deliberate process, while Charles was still on the throne, and that this represented power no royal in William's position had ever held before him. Constitutional authority, moving from a sick king to his son, in real time, with no ceremony and no headline. Now here's what's actually documented, and it undercuts nearly every part of that framing. First, this was never quiet, and it was never secret. Buckingham Palace announced it publicly on June 30, 2025, 5 months before the December broadcast, in a statement carried by royal correspondents across major outlets. Ian Patrick, William's private secretary, gave an on-the-record quote about the Prince and Princess of Wales being delighted to recognise British industry and craftsmanship through the granting of warrants. There was a defined application process. Existing Prince of Wales warrant holders had a July 2025 deadline to reapply, new applicants would be considered afterward, and the first warrants under William and Catherine were expected in spring 2026. None of that resembles a secret transfer discovered by insiders. It resembles a standard palace press release, covered by Hello, Marie Claire, Royal Central, and the Royal Press Pool, months before anyone was framing it as a hidden story. Second, and this is the part that really breaks the unprecedented claim, William isn't the first Prince of Wales to hold this power. Charles did too. During his own decades as Prince of Wales, before he became king, Charles personally granted 159 royal warrants of his own. When he became king in 2022, those warrants became void, with a grace period for holders to phase out the old branding. Being a grantor of royal warrants has, historically, been a normal feature of being Prince of Wales, not a power reserved exclusively for the reigning monarch. Kate becoming a grantor is more genuinely notable in one specific sense: she's the first Princess of Wales to hold that power since Princess Mary of Teck in 1910, which is a real and interesting historical marker. But William inheriting warrant-granting authority as Prince of Wales isn't new. It's the family business. Third, this wasn't Charles losing something. It was Charles handing something down, deliberately, the way the role has worked before. The palace's own framing, through Ian Patrick's statement, was about William and Catherine building their own relationships with British industry ahead of the future, the same kind of institution building every Prince of Wales before him has done. Royal watchers and fashion commentators speculated enthusiastically about which brands might get Kate's warrant, the same way they'd speculate about any royal fashion story. Nobody inside the reporting cycle, at the time it happened, treated it as evidence of a monarch's authority slipping away against his will. So when you put those three facts together, the load-bearing claim behind the secret handover story doesn't survive contact with the record. It was public, it was traditional, and it was Charles's own decision, announced through his son's office with his blessing. That doesn't mean nothing interesting is happening inside the working relationship between Charles and William. It means the Royal Warrant story specifically isn't the evidence for it that it was made out to be. It's also worth sitting with how long this rollout actually took, because a real timeline is a poor match for a quiet, sudden power grab narrative. The announcement came in June 2025. Existing warrant holders had until the end of that July to reapply. New applicants were then invited to come forward, with William and Kate's household conducting the same due diligence process the King and Queen's household uses, checking that a company had genuinely supplied goods or services to the household for at least 5 of the past 7 years, the same threshold that's applied to every royal warrant since the rules were formalized. The first warrants under their names weren't expected to be granted until spring 2026, a full 9 months or more after the announcement. That's not the pacing of an emergency transfer of authority slipped through while the country's attention was elsewhere. That's the pacing of an institution doing paperwork, the same paperwork it's done for other grantors for 5 centuries. And there's a telling detail buried in the reporting that the original story missed entirely. Royal watchers spent that entire lead-up period speculating not about constitutional implications, but about which fashion and lifestyle brands might get Kate's warrant first, the same kind of chatter that follows any new royal appointment. Fashion journalist Elizabeth Holmes, who covers royal style, told Town and Country she expected Kate's warrant to introduce the whole tradition to a younger generation of royal watchers who follow the family through her wardrobe choices. That's the actual tenor of the coverage in real time, excitement about a style milestone, not alarm about a constitutional one. Before we get to William's actual public record, it's worth pausing on something the original story treated as almost mystical, the idea of monarchical power moving to an heir before a formal accession, as though no framework existed for that at all, and anything resembling it had to be improvised in secret. That's not true. British constitutional law has an entire, publicly documented system built specifically for a monarch who is ill or unavailable, and it's been used, openly, multiple times in recent years. It works in 2 tiers. The first is the Office of Councillor of State, created by the Regency Act 1937, which lets the monarch delegate day-to-day functions, signing routine documents, holding Privy Council meetings, receiving ambassadors' credentials, to his spouse and the next adults in line of succession, whenever he's travelling abroad or dealing with a short-term illness. This isn't unusual or secretive. Charles has used it repeatedly since his diagnosis, and the current pool of councillors of state, expanded by Parliament in 2022 specifically so the role wouldn't have to fall to Andrew or Harry, includes Camilla, William, Anne, and Edward. It's public knowledge, published on the royal family's own website, exactly who holds this authority and what they can and can't do with it. Councillors of state cannot grant titles, cannot dissolve Parliament except on the King's own instruction, and cannot handle a defined list of core constitutional functions reserved for the monarch alone. The second, heavier tier is a regency, which only activates if the monarch is formally declared incapacitated, a determination that can only be made by a specific group, the King's spouse, the Lord Chancellor, the Lord Chief Justice, the Master of the Rolls, and the Speaker of the House of Commons, acting together. If that threshold were ever met, the Regency Act names exactly who would step in, William, as the next adult in the line of succession. That's not a secret arrangement discovered by insiders. It's been settled law since 1937, publicly reported on every time Charles's diagnosis has prompted constitutional analysts to explain what would happen if his condition worsened. Constitutional scholars have written, openly, that even short of a full regency, a so-called soft regency is possible, where Charles keeps his core, non-delegable functions like royal assent while William takes on a steadily larger share of ceremonial duties. State openings of Parliament, Remembrance Sunday, Trooping the Colour, exactly the kind of visible, public-facing role William has, in fact, been taking on. Commentators were describing this as a live possibility as far back as February 2024, within days of Charles's original diagnosis, in on-the-record legal analysis, not gossip. I'm including all of this because it changes the shape of the entire story. The original narrative treated William's growing visibility as evidence of something happening in the shadows, outside any known structure, because no legitimate mechanism was ever named for it. But a legitimate mechanism exists, has existed for nearly 90 years, is fully public, and has already been invoked in smaller ways multiple times during Charles's treatment. What's actually observable? William hosting investitures, representing his father abroad, appearing at state occasions, tracks closely with what constitutional experts predicted, in public, using this exact framework, well over a year before any of the insider reporting about a secret inner circle ever appeared. That's a very different story than a hidden power grab. It's an heir doing, in daylight, roughly what the law says an heir does when a monarch is managing a serious illness. If the theory is that William has been steadily absorbing his father's role while the cameras looked elsewhere, the actual public record complicates that picture more than it supports it. Start with investitures, since that's specifically where the William leading ceremonies alone claim gets made. Investitures, the ceremonies where honours like MBEs and OBEs are formally bestowed, are hosted by the King, the Princess Royal, and the Prince of Wales. William hosting some of them isn't new or secret, it's part of the job description he's had since becoming Prince of Wales in 2022. But here's what the actual 2026 record shows: the first investiture of the year wasn't hosted by William at all. It was hosted by Princess Anne on January 13th, while Charles was still in Scotland on his winter break and before William had hosted any that year. And according to a July 2025 profile in the Sunday Times, Anne had reportedly been privately critical of William in the past for not taking on more of what she called the bread-and-butter royal duties, investitures specifically, given that he lives a short distance from Windsor Castle where many of them are held. That's not a picture of a Prince of Wales aggressively absorbing ceremonial power. If anything, it's the opposite complaint, coming from inside the family, about William doing less of this specific duty than some relatives think he should. William did host his own first investiture of 2026 later that January, handing honours to figures including Microsoft UK's chief executive and former England footballer Millie Bright. That's a real, normal function of his role. It is not evidence of him quietly displacing his father from something Charles was still doing himself. Now, the state visit. Trooping the colour offers another useful data point, because it's the one major annual event where the whole family appears together on the Buckingham Palace balcony, and it's exactly the kind of occasion where a real, visible power shift would be impossible to hide. In June 2026, William and Catherine appeared alongside Charles and Camilla at the ceremony in what multiple outlets described as a deliberately unified display, the two couples presented as a working team rather than as a king visibly ceding ground to his son. That's the opposite of the two images, completely different meanings, framing the original story leaned on. It's one image, both generations, presented together, on purpose, the way the palace has staged that particular event for generations. The March 2026 state visit example that got used as the visual proof of two images, same event, completely different meanings deserves its own close look, because this is where the gap between documented fact and invented color is widest. Here's what's confirmed. On March 18, 2026, King Charles hosted Nigerian President Bola Ahmed Tinubu and First Lady Oluyemi Tinubu for a state banquet at St. George's Hall, Windsor Castle, the first Nigerian state visit to the UK in decades, and the first incoming state visit by a Muslim head of state during Ramadan since 1928. The palace made real, documented accommodations for that. A prayer space for arriving guests, pre-banquet canapés since the meal itself wouldn't start until 9 p.m. after the president had privately broken his Ramadan fast, and a bespoke non-alcoholic cocktail inspired by a classic Nigerian drink. William and Kate greeted the president and First Lady that morning at their hotel, then took part in the formal welcome, carriage procession, and banquet alongside Charles and Camilla. Charles delivered a formal welcome speech, praising Nigeria's growth and its young population, and was photographed holding hands with President Tinubu during the ceremonial welcome, a warm and notably documented gesture, not a moment of visible frailty. What is not confirmed, anywhere in contemporaneous reporting from outlets that covered the visit in real time, is the specific and vivid claim that Charles nearly slumped into his chair from exhaustion that evening, while William and Kate radiated youthful confidence beside him. That detail doesn't appear in the ITV, Royal.UK, or Hello Live coverage of the event. It has the shape of the kind of unsourced, dramatized detail that tends to get added to a real event after the fact to make an existing narrative land harder. I'm flagging that specifically because it's exactly the kind of claim that sounds plausible inside a story like this and is very hard to verify or debunk once it's out there. The honest answer is, I can't confirm it happened, and the outlets that covered the banquet in detail don't report it. It's worth adding, too, that Kate's role in these same occasions has been growing in parallel, which the original story left out entirely despite it being one of the more genuinely documented threads in this whole period. Royal correspondence covering the March 2026 Nigerian state visit noted explicitly that the Prince and Princess of Wales are taking on an increasing share of responsibility for high-profile, nationally significant occasions, framed openly, in real time, as preparation for the roles they'll eventually hold. Kate in particular was described as having become something of the standout presence at state banquets over the preceding year, having charmed guests at 3 separate state banquets in 2025 alone. That's a genuinely notable trend, and it's confirmed by contemporaneous reporting rather than anonymous sourcing. But notice what it actually describes. A gradual, visible, openly acknowledged broadening of the Wales's public role, discussed candidly by royal correspondents as exactly what it is, not a secret operation uncovered after the fact. There's also the November 2025 COP30 example, which is real and worth including precisely because it's a legitimate, on-the-record instance of William standing in for his father, the kind of thing the original story gestured at without citing. Charles and William appeared together at a countdown to COP30 event in London that October, and William then attended the COP30 World Leaders Summit in Belém, Brazil, on his father's behalf that November. That's confirmed. It's also entirely unremarkable by royal standards. Heirs to the throne represent the monarch at events the monarch can't attend for all kinds of reasons, health being one of many. It isn't evidence of a secret realignment. It's what the role of Prince of Wales has always partly been for. This is the part of the original story I want to be most careful with, because it's also the part built almost entirely on unnamed sourcing, and I think it deserves to be named as such rather than repeated as though it carries the same weight as the confirmed material above. The claim that William has deliberately built a small, trusted circle of advisors operating on a strict need-to-know basis, separate from his father's household, with his diary and strategic planning handled independently, traces back to gossip aggregators and royal commentary substacks, not to palace statements or named, on-record sourcing from people who were actually there. One representative example. An April 2026 piece from the Royal Observer, drawing on a royal commentator's Substack, reported that as Charles departed for a US state visit, William was said to be using the window to quietly convene key figures and hold forward-looking conversations about the monarchy's future. The direct quote attributed to a source was that William was, in their words, using the window to convene key figures privately. That's a real quote, from a real published piece. It is also a single unnamed source, relayed through a commentator, in an outlet built around exactly this kind of royal insider content. It isn't confirmed by the palace, and it isn't independently corroborated elsewhere. Similar caveats apply to the broader radar online and syndication ecosystem around this story, including outlets like Stylecaster and AOL picking up the same wire content that reported Charles would let his illness take its action before eventually standing down, and that William was already underway in transitioning toward kingship. Read closely, even those pieces rely on Jobson's actual on-record comments for their only verifiable content, and then build speculative headlines and framing around them that go well beyond what Jobson himself said. I want to be direct about why this distinction matters, rather than just noting it and moving on. None of this means the underlying human situation isn't real. It would be strange if a 77-year-old monarch managing a lung cancer diagnosis wasn't leaning more on his heir, and it would be strange if a Prince of Wales in his early 40s, watching his father manage a serious illness, wasn't thinking seriously and personally about his own future role. Both of those things are almost certainly true in some form. What isn't established is the specific, dramatic architecture that got layered on top of that ordinary human reality. The secret camp, the need-to-know operation, the deliberate structural break from his father's household. That's the part where insiders say is doing all the work, and where I think it's fair to tell you plainly that I can't verify it, because as far as I can find, nobody with a name attached to their claim has verified it either. I want to walk through the mechanics here for a second, because understanding how this particular story moved from a real, minor, on-the-record quote into a much bigger claim tells you something useful, not just about the royal family, but about how this entire genre of content works. It typically starts with one small piece of real, on-the-record material. In this case, that's Jobson's actual podcast appearance, a genuinely newsworthy interview with a credentialed royal biographer, saying something specific and verifiable about Charles's health outlook. From there, a wire-style outlet, commonly one running under the radar online byline or a syndication partner like Stylecaster, AOL, or Yahoo Entertainment, republishes the quote, but wraps it in a headline built around a much larger claim the quote doesn't actually make, something like an abdication prediction or a succession reveal. A second tier of outlets, sites like SHFines, Reality T, and the Royal Observer, then aggregate that headline into their own version, often adding a fresh unnamed insider or source quote that doesn't trace back to anyone identifiable and doesn't appear in the original reporting at all. By the third or fourth generation of republication, you end up with dozens of articles that all look independently sourced, because they're published under different mastheads, but that actually trace back to one interview and a chain of unverified additions layered on top of it. That's not a uniquely royal media phenomenon. It's how most viral insider stories about any public figure work, whether it's a monarch, a celebrity couple, or a tech executive. The tell is almost always the same. A single piece of real, attributable reporting near the bottom of the family tree, and an increasingly dramatic, increasingly unsourced set of claims stacked on top of it as it spreads. The York Royal Warrant timeline, the investiture pattern, and the state banquet all show that same structure once you trace them back far enough: real event, real minor detail, unverified embellishment, repetition until the embellishment reads as established fact. None of that means everything built on top of a real quote is automatically false. Sometimes the embellishment turns out to be accurate, confirmed later by more solid reporting. But it does mean the responsible way to read a story like this one is to ask, every single time a dramatic claim shows up, whether it traces back to something you can actually verify, or whether it only traces back to another article that was, itself, only repeating the claim. Because Jobson's comments get cited so often as supporting evidence in this story, I think it's worth walking through what he actually said, on the record, rather than the fragments that get lifted out of it. Speaking on Tom Sykes's Royalist podcast on April 8, 2026, Jobson was responding directly to speculation that Charles's health, combined with William's growing visibility, meant an abdication was coming. His answer was a clear no. He described watching Charles at events, visibly exhausted, at points nearly falling asleep on his feet, while still showing up and doing the job, which Jobson framed as evidence of the king's deep, almost stubborn sense of duty, not evidence of a man preparing to leave. His actual prediction, if Charles's health ever became genuinely incompatible with the role, wasn't that Charles would step down from the throne. It was that Charles would step back from treatment instead, letting the illness, in Jobson's phrase, take its course, while remaining king for as long as he physically could. That's a meaningfully different claim than Charles is being quietly eased out. It's closer to the opposite, a biographer with direct access describing a monarch who intends to hold the role until his body makes it physically impossible, and who would rather stop fighting the disease than stop being king. Jobson also pushed back, in the same interview, on the idea that December's cancer update meant more than it did, calling the coverage somewhat overhyped and stating plainly that Charles is living with cancer long-term, not recovering from it. If you're building a story about what's actually happening inside the palace, Jobson's real comments belong in it. But they support a story about a determined, ill monarch clinging tightly to his duty, not a story about a monarch being maneuvered out of it. It's worth being precise about who Jobson actually is here, too, because his credibility is doing real work in this story, and it's earned rather than assumed. He's a long-time royal correspondent and biographer who has covered the family for decades, written multiple books on Charles's reign specifically, and is generally regarded within royal watching circles as having genuine, direct access to palace sources rather than relying purely on second-hand tabloid syndication. That's precisely why his comments get picked up and recirculated so widely every time he speaks. It's also exactly why it matters that his actual, careful, on-the-record framing, a king living with a chronic illness who intends to keep working, gets flattened, once it passes through a few rounds of aggregation, into headlines implying an abdication, reveal or a succession plan. The distortion isn't happening at the source. Jobson said something fairly measured and specific. It's happening in the layers of repackaging between his interview and the version of the story most people actually encountered. That gap, between what a credible, named source actually said and what got attributed to him by the time the story reached a wide audience, is worth remembering the next time a royal story built around one biographer's podcast appearance starts circulating with a much bigger headline attached to it. One more thing worth adding, because the original framing of this story treated the December broadcast and the Royal Warrant announcement as though they existed in a vacuum, when the actual period around them was dominated by something else entirely, and it's directly relevant to why the palace's public messaging looked the way it did. In October and November of 2025, in the weeks immediately surrounding all of this, the monarchy was absorbing the fallout from the Prince Andrew scandal. On October 17, Andrew announced he would stop using his Duke of York title amid renewed scrutiny of his association with Jeffrey Epstein. 2 weeks later, on October 30, Buckingham Palace announced Charles had initiated a formal process to strip Andrew of his styles, titles, and honours altogether. By early November, letters patent formally removed his right to the style of Royal Highness and the title of Prince, and he became known as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. He also surrendered his lease on Royal Lodge. NBC News, reporting on the December cancer broadcast itself, noted explicitly that Charles had spent the preceding months managing this public storm around his brother rather than fielding questions about his own health, which had until then usually dominated royal coverage on its own. The Andrew story is worth a bit more detail on its own terms, because the contrast with the Royal Warrant story is instructive. When the palace actually did strip someone of real, formal, constitutional standing, it happened through visible, traceable legal steps, letters patent under the Great Seal of the realm, published in the London Gazette, government confirmation from Downing Street that it had been cleared in advance, a formal royal warrant instructing the Lord Chancellor to prepare the paperwork, and a banner removed from St. George's Chapel in a documented ceremony. Even Andrew's surname change, from Prince Andrew to Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, and the small correction the palace issued 2 weeks later to add a hyphen after a newspaper asked about it, is a matter of public record down to the punctuation. That's what an actual, significant, contested change in a royal family member's formal status looks like when it happens: slow, bureaucratic, documented at every step, occasionally even a little bit fussy about hyphens. Compare that to how the alleged royal warrant power grab was supposed to have happened, quietly, with no paperwork trail, no named officials, no dated process, and the difference in evidentiary weight is stark. One of these stories has letters patent, a Gazette notice, and a Downing Street statement behind it. The other has a private secretary's routine quote and, beyond that, unnamed sources. That context matters, because a monarchy managing a genuine institutional crisis around Andrew, while also trying to communicate honestly about an ongoing cancer diagnosis, while also formally handing a traditional Prince of Wales duty down to the next generation, is a much messier and more human picture than a tidy narrative about a secret succession plot. It's also, I'd argue, a more interesting one, because it's true. Let's total it up honestly. Confirmed. Charles was diagnosed with an undisclosed form of cancer in February 2024, discovered incidentally during treatment for an unrelated, benign condition. He has kept the specific type private on his medical team's advice. He was briefly hospitalized again in March 2025. In December 2025, he shared a genuine and positive update that his treatment schedule could be reduced, while the palace simultaneously described his care moving into a precautionary, continuously monitored phase, language that describes ongoing management, not remission or resolution. Confirmed. William and Catherine were publicly and formally announced as future grantors of royal warrants in June 2025, a role Charles himself held as Prince of Wales, with named palace officials on the record about it, and a defined application timeline that played out in public view over the following year. Confirmed. William has taken on real, visible duties befitting a Prince of Wales approaching midlife, hosting investitures, representing his father at COP30, and appearing alongside his parents at major state occasions like the March 2026 Nigerian state visit. Some of this is genuinely more visible than it might have been for a Prince of Wales decades ago, none of it is unprecedented, and some family members have reportedly wanted to see William do more of it, not less. Not confirmed, and resting entirely on unnamed sourcing, that William has built a deliberately separate, need-to-know inner operation independent of his father's household, that specific, dramatized moments like a near collapse at the Nigerian state banquet occurred as described, and that the overall trajectory amounts to a coordinated, quiet transfer of monarchical authority happening against Charles's wishes or without his knowledge. Directly contradicted by the record. That the Royal Warrant announcement was secret, sudden, or unprecedented. It was none of those three things. It's worth remembering, briefly, that royal reticence about a monarch's health is not new, and that measured against the family's own history, Charles has actually been unusually open, not unusually secretive. King George VI, Charles's grandfather, underwent surgery for lung cancer in September 1951, but the palace and his medical team never used the word cancer publicly at the time. The operation was described only as one to relieve bronchial obstruction. He died the following February, still without the public ever being told, in his lifetime, what had actually been growing in his chest. Queen Elizabeth II, famously private about her own health for the whole of her 70-year reign, gave the public almost no detail about the mobility issues that visibly affected her final 2 years, beyond the palace's now familiar phrase describing her difficulties simply as episodic. Prince Philip's numerous hospitalizations in his later years were disclosed only in the broadest terms, procedure types and hospital names, never full diagnoses. Set against that family history, Charles choosing to disclose the fact of a cancer diagnosis at all in February 2024 was actually a meaningful departure from generations of royal practice, not a continuation of a pattern of concealment. NPR's own coverage of his December 2025 update noted this directly, describing his willingness to disclose the diagnosis in the first place as a real departure for a family that has traditionally treated royal health as an intensely private matter. Judged against that baseline, keeping the specific type of cancer undisclosed, while volunteering the existence of the diagnosis, the general treatment timeline, and periodic honest updates on how it's progressing, looks less like a cover-up and more like a monarch trying to find a middle path between total privacy and total disclosure, in an institution that has almost always defaulted hard toward the former. The original telling of this story built in a running device, asking the audience direct questions, inviting comments, treating the story as an open mystery the viewer got to help solve. I'd rather just answer the actual questions honestly, using what's documented. Is Charles preparing to abdicate? No confirmed evidence supports that. His own public statements describe an intention to keep working, and Jobson, who has direct access, described on the record a king determined to hold the role until illness makes it physically impossible, not a king planning to hand it over voluntarily. Abdication remains one of 3 constitutionally available paths if Charles's health worsens significantly, alongside councillors of state for short-term gaps and a formal regency for full incapacity, but nothing in the documented record points toward it being chosen or planned. Is William already functioning as a kind of king in practice? Partially, and legally, in a narrow, well-defined way, through the Councillor of State mechanism he already holds, and through the Prince of Wales's traditional public duties, some of which he's leaned into and some of which, according to Princess Anne's own reported frustration, he's arguably leaned into less than family members would like. He is not exercising authority outside the legal framework, based on anything currently documented. Why won't the palace name Charles's specific type of cancer? Because, per a palace spokesperson's on-record explanation to CNN, medical advisors recommended he not identify his specific condition, so his public role could speak to the broader cancer community rather than narrowing attention to his own case. That's consistent with how Catherine's diagnosis was also handled, and consistent with a family that has historically kept health details private, now doing so with an articulated, on-record rationale rather than blanket silence. Was the royal warrant announcement really kept quiet? No. It was announced by Buckingham Palace in a public statement in June 2025, with a named palace officials on record, quote, 5 months before the December broadcast that supposedly revealed it, and it received ordinary royal press coverage, mostly framed around fashion and branding speculation at the time. Does any of this mean nothing is changing? No, and it would be dishonest to claim otherwise. A monarch in his late 70s managing a long-term illness is, by definition, going to lean more on his adult heir over time, and that heir is, by definition, going to be thinking hard about a role he knows is coming. What's not supported is the specific architecture layered on top of that ordinary reality. A deliberately secretive inner circle, a coordinated effort to sideline Charles, or evidence that any of this is happening against his wishes rather than within a legal and family structure that's existed, openly, for decades. I don't think the honest version of this story is less interesting than the dramatized one. I think it's more interesting because it's a version about real, ordinary difficulty instead of invented intrigue. It's the story of a 77-year-old monarch, the oldest person in British history to take the throne, managing a serious long-term illness in unusually public fashion, choosing transparency about the fact of his diagnosis while keeping its specifics private for reasons his own medical team could articulate on the record. It's the story of a Prince of Wales in his 40s, doing the specific, traditional things princes of Wales have done before him, at a pace some relatives reportedly think is too slow rather than too fast, while inevitably, quietly, thinking about a future role neither he nor anyone in his family wanted to arrive under these particular circumstances. And it's the story of an institution simultaneously working through a genuinely damaging scandal involving Andrew, which had far more concrete, documented consequences, stripped titles, surrendered leases, formal letters patent, than anything actually proven about William's supposed inner circle. Charles has said clearly and repeatedly, through his own public statements and through people who've spoken to him directly like Jobson, that he intends to keep working for as long as his body allows it, and that nothing in the record suggests a plan to abdicate. William is doing the job his role has always partly required, sometimes more visibly than his father did at the same age, sometimes less than his own family reportedly wants. Both of those things can be true, and neither of them requires a secret plot to explain. If there's a genuine, quiet difficulty in this story, and I think there almost certainly is, it's not a power struggle. It's the plainer, harder thing underneath it, a father who built his entire adult life around a role he waited longer than any monarch in British history to formally hold, doing everything he can not to let illness take it from him a moment before he has to. And a son who never asked for any of this to arrive on this timeline, doing the ordinary, visible work of the role he already has, while the rest of the world keeps trying to read a coup into it. That's not a scandal. It's not a betrayal. It's what it actually looks like when a very old institution has to carry a very human problem in public, imperfectly, honestly, without a script for how to do it gracefully. Charles's next health update, whenever it comes, will tell us more about the medicine. It won't, on its own, tell us anything about a secret handover, because as far as the documented record shows, that story was never happening in the first place. I think there's a reason stories like the original version of this one travel so much further than the corrected one you just read. A secret power grab is a better story than a family managing an illness in public as honestly as an 800-year-old institution knows how. It has villains and victims and a hidden timeline you get to feel clever for uncovering. The real version doesn't offer any of that. It offers a sick, stubborn man who doesn't want to stop being king, a son who's doing a job that was always partly going to fall to him whether or not his father got sick, and an institution that, for once, told the public more of the truth than it usually does, and still ended up accused of hiding something. If anything, I'd say that's the real story here, not a secret transfer of power inside Buckingham Palace, but how quickly an honest, if incomplete, medical update can get reinterpreted into evidence of a conspiracy, simply because the audience has been trained by years of exactly this kind of content to expect that whatever the palace says publicly, the real story is always the one nobody's supposed to know. Sometimes that's true. Royal history has plenty of real examples where it was. This, based on everything documented and on the record right now, does not appear to be one of them. Charles is still king. He has said, through his own words and through people who've spoken with him directly, that he intends to stay that way for as long as his body allows it. William is doing the job in front of him, some of it more visibly than his father did at the same age, some of it less than his own family reportedly wishes he would. Nothing in the confirmed record describes a coup. It describes two men, and by extension two working households, trying to hold up the same very old, very demanding institution during the hardest stretch either of them has faced inside it, in full public view, imperfectly, and mostly honestly. That's a smaller story than the one that went viral. It also happens to be the true one.